For much of the war in Ukraine, Europe often seemed to be on the sidelines. Negotiations over the future of Ukraine were dominated by Washington and Moscow, with Kyiv at the centre, but often reliant on its American partner. That balance, however, appears to be shifting. Since the Ukraine summit in Washington earlier this month, a new role has been outlined for Europe, one that many leaders say they can no longer delay embracing. This week in Copenhagen, that role was put to the test. Foreign and defence ministers from across the European Union gathered for informal but critical meetings with one central question before them. Can Europe deliver on its promise to guarantee Ukraine's security, not just in words, but in lasting commitments? For years, European capitals struggled to influence negotiations that were largely steered by Washington. Even as Moscow escalated the war and Kyiv resisted, Europeans often acted as financial backers and suppliers rather than equal decision makers. The US, with its vast military support, dictated the pace. But the Washington summit marked a turning point, with US officials making clear that Europe must take the lead in securing Ukraine's post-war future. Responsibility has now shifted. In practical terms, this means Europe, not America, will need to design, lead and enforce the system of security guarantees for Ukraine. These guarantees are not symbolic. They aim to prevent Russia from launching another offensive after a peace settlement. They may include European troop deployments inside Ukraine, a prospect that has already divided parliaments and stirred debates across the continent. Russia has firmly rejected the idea of foreign soldiers stationed on Ukrainian soil, branding it as provocation. But for Kyiv and its allies, the credibility of any peace agreement rests precisely on such guarantees. Without them, Ukraine fears Moscow will regroup and strike again. That is why Copenhagen became the stage for days of tense discussions. Behind closed doors, diplomats and defence chiefs debated not whether to help Ukraine, that much was already agreed, but how far they were willing to go. The arrival of EU Chief of Diplomacy Kaja Kallas and Denmark's Defence Minister Troels Lund Poulsen underscored the seriousness of the moment. As cameras flashed, the message was clear. Europe is no longer a bystander, yet uncertainty lingers. While there is strong political will, the details remain vague. What exactly would a European security guarantee look like? How many troops, under what mandate and for how long? Would they serve as peacekeepers, deterrents or frontline defenders? The most visible battle is now unfolding in Berlin. Germany, long criticised for caution, is under pressure to step up. Officials have confirmed that Germany wants to participate in security guarantees for Ukraine. But what that means in practice is dividing both parliament and public opinion. The central issue, Bundeswehr deployment. Would German ground troops be stationed in Ukraine? If so, under what authority? Many lawmakers argue that sending soldiers into Ukraine risks a direct confrontation with Russia. Others counter that without troops, guarantees will be meaningless. Foreign Minister Johan Vadfull, CDU, is set to use Copenhagen to push his counterparts for stronger commitments. He is expected to say that Europe cannot afford hesitation. After Russia's latest strikes on Ukrainian cities, Vadfull believes the time for cautious diplomacy is over. He will urge the EU to expand both its military support and economic sanctions against Moscow. The United States, while still committed to Ukraine, has been clear it does not intend to send large numbers of troops. Instead, Washington wants Europeans to shoulder this role, with American support limited to intelligence, training and possibly air cover. For Europe, this is both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, it forces the continent to take responsibility for its own security, something Washington has urged for decades. On the other, it exposes the divisions within Europe, between those ready to lead militarily and those wary of provoking Russia further. As ministers met in Copenhagen, events in Ukraine underscored the urgency. In Kyiv, new Russian missile strikes left streets covered in debris, residential blocks in ruins, and emergency workers pulling the injured from rubble. Images released by the Ukrainian presidency and emergency services showed destroyed cars, shattered buildings, and rescuers carrying civilians on stretchers. For Ukrainian leaders, these pictures are proof that Europe cannot wait. Without concrete guarantees, they argue, Moscow will never stop. President Volodymyr Zelensky has been blunt in his appeals. Standing beside US President Donald Trump in Washington earlier this month, he pushed hard for more than weapons. What Ukraine needs, Zelensky argued, is assurance that its sovereignty will never again be left exposed. The discussions in Copenhagen are also tied to NATO's evolving posture. With Finland and Sweden now fully integrated, the alliance has expanded its reach across the Baltic and Arctic. Exercises in Romania and France have highlighted Europe's growing readiness, with tanks rolling across fields and generals saluting troops. But NATO, too, faces limits. Not every member is prepared to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. Some prefer to keep NATO's role defensive while leaving direct commitments to the EU. This division makes the Copenhagen talks even more crucial, because if the EU cannot agree on a framework, the security vacuum could undermine both NATO unity and Ukraine's stability. Alongside military guarantees, Europe is preparing new sanctions on Russia. The latest attacks on Kiev have reignited calls for stricter measures, especially targeting energy exports and financial networks. Wadful and other ministers want Copenhagen to mark not only a military step forward, but also an economic one. Sanctions remain one of Europe's strongest tools, but their effectiveness depends on unity. Countries with deeper energy ties to Russia, such as Hungary, remain reluctant. Yet with every strike on Ukraine, the pressure grows to close loopholes and cut Moscow's revenues. In the end, the debates in Copenhagen are not just about treaties and troop deployments. They are about lives. The images from Kyiv serve as constant reminders. Children carried to safety by rescuers, homes reduced to rubble, and families forced once again to flee. For many ministers, these pictures drive home the stakes. Europe cannot afford another cycle of promises without action. If peace is to be secured, it must be enforced. And that enforcement will require risks, sacrifices and leadership. Europe has long spoken of unity, but rarely has the test been so stark. For years, Washington's leadership allowed some European governments to delay difficult choices. Now, with the US stepping back, the burden falls on Europe. Copenhagen may not deliver all the answers, but it signals a new phase. The era of Europe as a spectator is over. What comes next will define not just Ukraine's future, but Europe's place in global security. As one diplomat in the Danish capital put it bluntly, this is the hour of the Europeans. Either we step up or we step aside.